From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Wes Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to our second session. This is going to be a marathon session like this morning. We have four terrific speakers who will be speaking back to back with you, and then we'll take questions at the end. The first speaker is Dick Pflederer. Now, Dick is an international businessman. He has an extensive history abroad. He's lived in Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Brazil. And Brazil is important. While he was in Singapore, he became interested in maps of Asia, early maps of Asia. But it was his Portuguese background that allowed him to fall in love with charts and the Portuguese exploration of Asia. And this has grown and grown. At one point, he was invited to catalog the British Library's Portolan chart collection, and it's really taken off from there. He has now authored 7 different books about navigational charts, and including one book that has just come out, I'll show this one to you, called Finding Your Way at Sea. And this is a more popular, his other works are very sophisticated technical works. This is a more popular work that even I can understand, and it's great reading. He has conducted a lot of research, and he's been very involved in prestigious libraries around the country. And this includes his being a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. And I can tell you he has been very significant with the map societies around the United States. He's an advisor to the Portolan magazine, the Society for the History of Discoveries, the International Map Collector Society. He was so desperate for lectures on maps that he even founded his own group, the Williamsburg Map Circle. And now his primary residence is in Williamsburg, but he and his wife, Sue, who's in the audience, they spend 5 months a year in Montepulciano, Tuscany. Doesn't that sound fantastic? What's with the rest of our lives that we haven't organized ourselves that way? So onward with our understanding of Waldseemüller's Carta Marina and the environment in which that was made. So I give you Dr. Portolano.
Well, thanks a lot, Wes. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be part of this conference on these 2 milestone works by Martin Waldseemüller. But I have to say, listening to John's talk this morning, it really struck me when I hear his description of Schoner and these other scholars, the chasm between these academic cartographers, most a lot in Germany, and the producers of these Portolan charts that I have been personally involved in, and I'll be talking about this afternoon. It's a big difference, but I think we look at both together and we get a pretty good idea of what Europeans understood about the world in the early 16th century. Now, my goal this afternoon is not to talk about the Carta Marina, but rather to try to explain what was the status or what was the condition of nautical cartography in Europe at the time of Waldseemüller. And I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of that. The first is stylistic considerations, and the second is cartographic content. But first, I wanted to give a bit of a historical background on how the sea charts were developed that were so important in particularly the Carta Marina. These charts and their tradition begins, as far as we're concerned, in the late 13th century when the oldest Portolan chart was drawn. This chart, along with the contemporary cousins, the so-called Portolani, which are textual sailing instructions, apparently owe their origins to some unknown compilation of practical navigating knowledge by Med-Sea mariners. How, when, and by whom all this was compiled and assembled in a place that could be represented on a chart is still not known. But once this first chart, the carte Pizan, was drawn, it determined a style of sea chart that would persist well into the 18th century. So let's take a look at this chart and zoom in a bit. This is a little bit beat up. It's over, 600 years old? But stylistically, these charts have changed little since then. They were manuscript, they were drawn on vellum, and they were drawn against a radiating network of rhumb lines with the place names perpendicular to the coast on the land side, and as you can see from this chart, minimal or zero detail in the interior of the land masses. Now, we believe that these charts were derived from a combination of compass directions and sailing distances between points. And this system of distance and direction determined the structure of these charts, which is a radial structure, conceptually different from most of the other kinds of maps we know about. For example, the Ptolemaic maps and projection like Mercator's depend on a structure of coordinates, latitude and longitude, for example. But the medieval mariners didn't have any way to determine their latitude or their longitude at sea, so this radial structure, I want to go so many miles in this direction, seemed to make more sense. I'd like to show you now in an example of a portolan chart what I mean by radial structure. One of the most recognizable features of these portolan charts are the array of rhumb lines. And at first glance, they might seem like they're a little bit random, but in fact, they follow a very definite pattern. I'd like to look at this chart by Grazioso Benincasa to explain this pattern. First off, I say Grazioso Benincasa is a good example of the kind of cartographer that wasn't in Sandier doing academic research. He was a mariner, a navigator, a sailor who had lost his ship to pirates when he was about 40 years old and decided that life on shore might be a little bit more satisfying. The way these lines are drawn are as follows. First off, a hidden circle is drawn, and then the compass points, they're bisected again, and then at the points where these radial lines hit the hidden circle, those become nodes for secondary radiating lines. And that's in fact the system that's used universally to put the rhumb lines on portolan charts. I'd like to look now at the rhumb line pattern on the Carta Marina. And I'll show you that they were produced in exactly the same way. So what does this tell us? We can see that Waldseemüller was using the same system of rhumb lines for his chart that were standard on portolan charts at that point in time. He was trying then to emulate the perceived precision that was kind of the most important aspect of portolan charts in the world of Europe in those days. But not all of the stylistic features of these manuscript charts were carried over to the Carta Marina, but several of them did. These are some of those features that I had described, and I don't think I have to read that to you, but I will put a little table over here that shows which of those Waldseemüller chose to use. First off, he was not making a manuscript chart. He did use rhumb lines, 16, it turns out 16 lines radiating out from the center. He had 10 compass roses on that chart. The place names were exactly as they are found on portolan charts. The latitude scale, which appeared on later portolan charts, is on this Carta Marina, as well as the equator and the tropics are highlighted. From the standpoint of detail of the land masses, he put in more than on a typical portolan chart. Now, there's one more feature of portolan charts that found its way onto the Carta Marina, and this involves the angular rotation of the chart relative to true compass directions. And I'd like to explain what I mean by using this chart by Visconti Maggiolo as an example. Now, I'll draw this horizontal line, and that line represents the east and west direction that you would derive from the compass roses on the chart. But in fact, that is not the true east-west line. And I'll draw another line. This is the 36th parallel. And we know that that 36 degrees north latitude line passes through Gibraltar, and it also passes north of Cyprus in the east. And you can see that we're deviant by about 9 degrees of clockwise direction. And this anomaly appears on virtually every single portolan chart from the earliest one in 1290 up through the middle of the 15th century and 16th century and beyond. Let's take a look now at the Carta Marina and see if Waldseemüller copied this anomaly also. And I'll zoom in here, and we'll pick out the European part, and we'll look at that in detail. And you can see exactly the same situation. The compass roses show a horizontal line for east-west, but in fact, the true one is this 9 degrees deviation. Now, as I said, the style of the carte paysanne continued for centuries, and I just wanted to show a couple of examples as we approach the time of Waldseemüller. This one is by Gabriel Valseca, 1439. You can see it is a lot more decorative on the interior, but in fact the cartography is almost traceable as the same, and just the appearance of it is different. But not all the charts, let's say, evolve from plain to decorative, as this chart by Giacomo Giroldi, 1443, shows, and you can see that it's the same cartography, the same style, but does not have the decoration of the Valseca chart and is therefore considerably more austere. So at least from a stylistic point of view, European nautical cartography became fairly stable. But the cartography itself was about to change dramatically about this time, about the middle of the 15th century. And the primary cause of that was the Portuguese decision to exploit the development of new sea routes to find trading opportunities outside of traditional European sources. In the 1420s, Prince Henry of Portugal began promoting oceanic exploration, initially to Madeira and to the Azores, but in 1441 he obtained a charter that gave him exclusive rights to trade along the west coast of Africa. And he continued his interest in this region until his death in 1460. In this period, let's say the southern limit of European navigation gradually pushed farther and farther down. And I'd like to show this modern map to give you some idea of what was happening. The Cape Bojador in West Africa was a big stumbling block initially in 1434. Gil Ennis, sailing for the Portuguese, rounded that cape. Shortly thereafter, in 1441, Cabo Blanco, Nuno Tristão. The Cabo Verde Islands by the Venetian, Alvise Cadamasto. Then we get down to the equatorial region, São Tomé, 1470, by João de Santarém and Pedro Escobar. The goal was to round the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. That was accomplished in 1488 by Bartolomé Diaz, which in turn opened the door to the Indian Ocean and Vasco da Gama's voyage of 1498. The second Portuguese attempt to go by sea to India was captained by Pedro Cabral. He went a little bit too far west and stumbled upon Brazil in 1500. There was and then eventually did make it to India, by the way. There was another exploration in the northwest Atlantic. The brothers Cortes Real were exploring in Labrador and Newfoundland, but not specifically under the auspices of Prince Henry. Back in the Indian Ocean, we have Ceylon in 1505, and then the important trading point of Malacca in 1511, the Moluccas finally, and then South China in 1513. So I think we can say that in 80 years, the Portuguese had made an amazing accomplishment in terms of territory covering that they covered. Of course, the Portuguese expansion continued beyond that point in time, but I show these in order to show you the state of affairs when Waldseemüller began his Carta Marina. And as he says in the title of his chart, his goal was, quote, to produce a nautical chart that comprehensively showed the Portuguese voyages. So, beyond the traditional Med-Sea and European areas, which had been well documented for a couple of hundred years before Waldseemüller, I think we can agree that he basically owes the information on his map to the Portuguese for the rest of the world, excepting, of course, the more limited explorations the Spanish did in the Caribbean area. Now, even after the beginning of this oceanic exploration in the mid-15th century, cartographers obviously had to continue producing charts of the Med Sea. For example, this chart by Yehuda ben Zara, 1500. And the cartography of these Med Sea charts remained quite stable, and the only significant changes in them over the decades and centuries was a gradual evolution in place names. But for oceanic charts, the situation was quite different. The coverage areas were continually expanding, as you can see from that chart of the Portuguese. And this evolution in the charts implied a kind of a double function for the charts. Besides serving as a guide to voyagers as they went out from Europe, the charts also served a second purpose to more or less document the voyages of discovery, and therefore the discovery depended on the charts, but the charts in turn depended on the voyages to constantly renew themselves. Oceanic voyaging also required different kinds of ships than those used in the relatively contained waters of the Med Sea. Most notable in the West African exploration was the caravel, a new kind of ship that was developed under the auspices of Prince Henry from coastal fishing boats, Portuguese boats. Its shallow draft, smaller size, and speed made it ideal for coastal exploration, if not for actually carrying much cargo. But besides requiring new and better ships, new navigational techniques were required, especially since sailing down the coast of Africa means that latitude becomes the principal measure of the ship's progress and position. Knowing the ship's latitude in turn depended upon measuring the altitude of the sun above the horizon at local noon, and there were a variety of different instruments developed for this purpose. The most frequently used were these two, the astrolabe and the cross staff. They can be considered, in fact, precursors to the sextant, which was developed in the mid-18th century, but they were both considerably cheaper and simpler to operate and produce. The diagram explains the use of the cross staff. The sliding member in the mariner's right hand is slid up and down that main staff until each end, one respectively touches the sun and one touches the horizon. The astrolabe was made of bronze and is a bit more complicated. First off, it has these two little peepholes, and the mariner would sight through those holes up toward the sun, and then he could read the angle off of that scale. Naturally, as the navigational techniques evolved, the charts evolved too, but they did retain their basic structure, rhumb lines and so forth. But let's take a look at what these sea charts for the oceans looked like in this period. And I've got two Portuguese examples from the Atlantic, both by Pedro Rennell. This is the west coast of Africa, and I'm not sure you can see where we are, but you see the Cabo Verde Islands. This is a little bit hard to see that because it looks like Rennell ran out of chart, and he actually put some of the lower part, the southern part of that coast in the interior. But just to let you see a little better, I have moved that down, and you can get some idea then from this chart how he was representing the bulk of the coast of West Africa. This other chart, also by Pedro Rennell, is the North Atlantic, And it basically is intended to show transatlantic shipping opportunities. And I put that arrow on there to show that, that this is the first chart we know of that has a latitude scale included. Okay, one more chart of that period. This is a Francisco Rodriguez. This is a chart of the Spice Islands. And what I wanted to say is these charts are examples of charts that were more or less privately produced and covered relatively limited areas of the world, West Africa, or in this case, the Spice Islands. But the Portuguese authorities in the Casa de India also maintained a highly secret standard chart of the entire world. The idea being that they would incorporate, amend, add to that chart as information from the explorations came to their attention. So it's continuously revised and updated. And at the beginning of the 16th century, this secret chart represented some of the most highly sought after secret commercial intelligence in Europe. And not surprisingly, therefore, it was a target for clandestine efforts by foreign competitors. In 1502, a copy was obtained in Lisbon by Alberto Contino, who was the agent of the Duke of Ferrara. And exactly who drew this chart and how much Contino had to pay for it, we don't know. But when that chart was brought to Italy, it became the model for several manuscript copies. And one of those charts, one of the manuscript copies of this chart, which is what was used by Waldseemüller in his Carta Marina, and that was the one made by Niccolo Calverio. This is the chart, and to let you see the similarities, I'm going to put both of these charts slightly smaller size on the same slide, and I've put some blue ovals just to show some of the areas of that chart which you can almost see were basically direct copies. But I've also highlighted in yellow one detail which is significantly different, and that is the orientation of the Red Sea. So we can see how these features transferred from the Calverio chart, which was a manuscript chart. Calverio, by the way, is Italian, operated in Genova using this Portuguese model. But let's see how that carried over to the Carta Marina. And I'll put those same areas on there, and you can see that there's plenty of similar, in fact, there's actually almost perfect similarity with the Calverio. Now, as information on new discoveries poured into Europe, the world of nautical cartography in the 16th century was a fast-moving field. As I had said, there were frequent amendments to the Portuguese Padrão and its Spanish counterpart, the Padrão Real. But Waldseemüller, by using the Calverio chart, captured the best picture of the world as understood by Europeans at that point in time. And the fact that the structure of the Carta Marina followed the style and format of a Portolan chart is very understandable, because in its day, these Portolan charts were revered for their precision and objectivity. And in the 16th century, there are many examples of presentation atlases produced in this very same format, even if navigational or nautical mariners were not the objective of the work. Now, close analysis of this Carta Marina shows us that Waldseemüller captured about 232 degrees of longitude, which represents about 2/3 of the entire globe, which of course is similar to the east-west field on the Contino and on the Calverio. But what about that missing 128 degrees not captured in this chart? This, of course, was the Pacific Ocean, which was only guessed at in the 1507 map and not actually viewed by Europeans until 1513. Now, it was the fate of European charts in this period to run the risk of constantly being superseded almost as soon as they were completed. The Magellan voyage of 1519 to 1522 filled in the gap of that missing 128 degrees, and world charts soon reflected this more complete 360-degree view of the globe. This Salviati chart was named for its first owner, Cardinal Giovanni Salviati, who was the Papal Nuncio in Spain. And it's a good example of what I'm saying. It's a copy of the Spanish Padrón, drawn after Magellan completed his voyage, and therefore fairly accurately represents the Pacific Ocean. You can see the focus on that ocean, and you can also see where the missing 128 degrees came in. That line to the east is approximately the western extent of the Carta Marina and its antecedents. I would like to say, though, that none of what came after would diminish the importance of the Carta Marina and its role in documenting European understanding of the world in that early 16th century. In fact, the reduced-size copy published by Lorenz Fries in Strasbourg enjoyed a broad circulation even 9 years later, thus adding to the influence of Waldseemüller's view of the world. Now, Waldseemüller worked in the relatively cloistered academic world of Saint-Dié, hundreds of miles from the sea, where the mariners and makers of these other charts were developing the information he needed to produce his magnificent Carta Marina. He may not have gone to sea, probably never even visited these cartographers in the seaports, but yet his great intellectual contribution, I think, was his ability to synthesize all these other sources into his magnificent work using the mostly Italian maritime sources derived from the Portuguese voyages, which I described. So I think we're fortunate indeed to be able to see this milestone work by Waldseemüller right here in this library. That's it. I'd like to thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Maggie Ragnow began her career in the business world. Did you know that? In the business world. She was in advertising and owned an accounting firm. But she was smitten with the history bug, and she went back to the University of Minnesota and got a PhD in medieval and early history, modern history. And now, Dr. Ragnow is the curator of the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota. Now, if that's not enough, she's also the editor of Terra Incognita, which is the journal of the Society for the History of Discoveries. Would you rather have a lecture on generally accepted accounting principles or globe gores? Globe gores it is.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Library of Congress. We're delighted to be able to share our globe gores with the exhibition upstairs, and also to the Phillips Society for the invitation to speak to you about the globe gores today. In a diary entry dated December 29th, 1953, James Ford Bell noted, quote, "Mr. Parker came in, and we have discussed the possibilities of purchasing the Waldseemüller map. He will proceed to New York and spend a little time with Mr. Krauss and examining into the matter further. This represents a very substantial expense, although one which I feel will give distinguishment to the collection," end quote. In 1954, after 4 years of diligent negotiation by Jack Parker, the then curator of the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota, James Ford Bell purchased a small woodcut set of gores and in pristine condition from Prince Franz Joseph II of Liechtenstein. Mr. Bell then donated it to the Bell Collection at the university. The map first drew Mr. Bell's attention when it was put up for sale by Park Burnett Galleries in New York on behalf of the House of Liechtenstein in a public auction on 24 May 1950, 1 week shy of 63 years ago today. At the time, the seller's reserve price of $50,000 was not met. I know Mr. Bell certainly considered it too high, and Mr. Parker's negotiations began. The House of Liechtenstein had owned the map since 1883, when it was purchased as part of the estate of Franz Ritter von Hauslab, a former Field Marshal Lieutenant and Director of the Artillery for the Austrian Army. Von Hauslab received his formal education at the Academies of Fine Arts in Vienna and Munich, and applied both his artistic knowledge and talent to revolutionizing Austrian military cartography. Upon his retirement from the army in 1868, von Hauslab was appointed to the retinue of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, his former pupil. This position enabled him to pursue scholarly research on the history of the Austrian Empire and amass collections of related materials, particularly maps, which became widely known in international scientific and artistic circles. In 1883, Prince Johann II of Liechtenstein purchased von Hauslab's entire collection. Von Hauslab's globe gores was first identified with Waldseemüller in an 1872 article by F.A. de Varnhagen, while it was still in von Hauslab's possession. It was examined by Lucien Gallois once it came into possession of the House of Liechtenstein, and more definitively identified as Waldseemüller's in an 1890 article. It should be noted here that at this time, Waldseemüller's planisphere at Wolfegg Castle had not yet been discovered by Father Fischer. That discovery in 1901 occasioned a re-examination of the Hauslab-Liechtenstein globe gores, as it had become known. In their master work on the Waldseemüller maps, Fischer and Franz Weiser rehearsed the reasons the Hauslab-Liechtenstein globe gores was, in fact, the very same globe described by Waldseemüller in the Cosmographiae Introductio. Waldseemüller had described the globe as distinct from the larger planisphere with respect to degrees of latitude, distinctions that were present in the Hauslab-Liechtenstein globe gores. The coast of Guinea is about 10 degrees closer to the equator than on the planisphere. The Tropic of Cancer appears south of Haiti, while on the planisphere it runs directly through the island of Isabella or Cuba. And its representation of America, the degrees of latitude of the globe correspond exactly, according to them, with those found on contemporary Spanish and Portuguese maps, such as that of Juan de la Cosa, of Bartolomeo Colombo, the Jaime map, the Cantino and Canero maps. According to Waldseemüller, he followed Ptolemy with respect to the placement of the equator on the planisphere, but followed the nautical charts in Vespucci with respect to the globe. Thus, by 1901, the Hauslab-Liechtenstein globe gores, now the James Ford Bell Library globe gores, were confirmed to be those of Martin Waldseemüller. There have been no significant challenges to this attribution since that time, and indeed Mr. Bell purchased the globe gores with the understanding that it was Waldseemüller's. The globe gores is a woodcut printed from a single block of what is probably pear wood on watermarked sized paper. The full sheet measures 34 by 24 centimeters or 15.35 by 9.44 inches. When cut out and placed on a sphere, it forms a globe approximately 4.5 inches in diameter, about the size of a softball. The paper has evenly spaced chain lines, 2.5 centimeters in width, running vertically, and the watermark of a horned bull surmounted by a staff that ends in a cross, about which a snake with an arrowhead tongue is intertwined. The watermark measures 3 3/4 inches in length and at its widest point 1 3/8 inches. And on the slide here, the really crude drawing on one side is what was in the Park Bernay catalog when the Waldseemüller was put up for auction. I found in one of the online watermark databases the sort of muddy-looking drawing on the other side, and that's actually more what it looks like. It's still not identical, but it's a lot closer to the actual watermark. While there currently is no dispute that Waldseemüller was the creator of our globe gores, a few questions still remain. How many copies were printed? When were they printed? Where were they printed? Is the Bell edition a first edition or a first printing? There are several extant copies of the Cosmographio Introductio, the pamphlet Waldseemüller and his fellows at the Gymnasium at Saint-Dié produced to explain the two maps, the globe and the planisphere. While the Library of Congress holds the only extant exemplar of the planisphere, there are currently 5 known copies of the globe gores. The Bell copy, the first to be known, was first shown in public at the Congrès Géographique at Antwerp in 1871, and is noted above, purchased from the House of Liechtenstein for the Bell Library in 1954 for between $30,000 and $40,000. The second copy, bound in a 1486 Ptolemy atlas, was offered for sale by Sotheby's in 1960 and purchased by renowned collector and book dealer H.P. Krauss for $65,000. It was sold in 1991 to the Bavarian State Library in Munich for approximately 2 million Deutschmarks, at the time in excess of 1 million US. The third set of gores was discovered in a 1451 edition of Aristotle in 1993 by two researchers, Dr. Obnoff and Frau Dr. Vera Sack, while working in the Museum und Stadtbibliothek of Offenburg. They immediately recognized it because of the publicity surrounding the Bavarian acquisition 2 years earlier. The fourth set of globe gores was discovered in February 2003 by a private individual in Germany upon reading a newspaper account of the Munich copy and realizing that he too had a set among his large collection of books and ephemera cut out of their sheet preparatory to pasting on a sphere. It was offered for sale in 2005 by Christie's auction house in London, garnering just over $1 million. Just last year, 2012, a fifth copy was discovered by staff at the Ludwig Maximilian University Library in Munich. This set of gores had been folded and inserted between the pages of two geometry texts, bound together in 1871 by Viennese librarians who didn't know what they had. And as I noted before, this is before the Hauslab Liechtenstein globe was first shown in Antwerp. And there's no record that I've been able to find that they realized, even after that publicity, what they had. When the Munich University Library was damaged by fire during World War II, the folio, including the map, had already been removed to safety in an airtight box with the number 340. It ended up in the eastern Bavarian city of Landshut, and in 1955 was returned to Munich, where it sat unnoticed in the university archive for 58 years. This most recent find brought to light a set of globe gores different and probably later than the other four sets. It certainly is much cruder than the Bell set and has the words diameter globi printed above an angle line below the gores on the sheet to tell people, this is the size of the globe if you were to cut it out. For the most part, these sets of extant globe gores have survived because they were folded or bound into books. This certainly raises the possibility that additional copies may be found in future years. The very size of the globe these gores were meant to create is a handicap to its survival once constructed. A small globe is very easy to carry, but that also makes it easy to lose, easy to be tossed around like a softball by students, chewed upon by mice, and turned into a dog's plaything or a child's. The dating of these sets of gores is problematic. The most recent set does not match the others and could have been created at any time after 1507. Chet van Duzer has detailed these differences in his article, The Details, Date, Significance of the Fifth Set of Waldseemüller gores recently discovered in the Munich University Library. We know that Waldseemüller printed a set himself in 1509 at Strasbourg, but I believe this set to be too crudely done to be part of that print run, and I have shown them side by side. The top one is our globe gores, and the one on the bottom is the one that was found last year. The Bavarian State Library gores and the Offenburg gores do not have the watermark that's found on the Bell set and the set auctioned by Christie's, and thus it would seem that they're of different printing, though which printing it's impossible to determine at this time. And that brings me back to the globe gores of the Bell Library. In 2005, prior to auction, Tom Lamb, then director of books and manuscripts at Christie's, brought their set of globe gores to the Bell Library to compare it with ours. We compared and measured the chain lines, the watermark, the wear on the print block, and found them to be nearly identical in every respect. The main exception was that Christie's gores had been cut out of their original sheet. Tom had already compared the watermark in 4 1507 editions of the Cosmographia Introductio in the British Library, 2 copies here at the Library of Congress, and we compared one of the copies at the Bell Library. And although small fragments of the ox heads and parts of the crosses were discovered in several copies, no complete watermarks could be found. But at that time, I'd only been on the job a couple of months, and I didn't realize that we had more than one printing of the Introductio. Although the size is much smaller, a more complete bull's head watermark can be found in our April 1507 edition than in the August 1507 edition, which is the one that we compared with the Christie's gores. Unfortunately, all this means is that the paper source for our globe gores and the April 1507 edition of the Introductio might be the same. So dating the gores remains a challenge, which also means that we don't know which printing we have, which edition we have. A lot more work needs to be done on that, and as you heard this morning, watermark research is very intense and ongoing. There are databases now that are putting a lot of these watermarks online, but they're still not all out there, and there's a lot of work still needs to be done. There has also been a great deal of discussion about the number of copies printed of Waldseemüller's 1507 output, the planisphere, the globe gores, and the pamphlet. The reference to 1,000 copies of the planisphere printed on the Carta Marina of 1516 has intrigued many. Given the present state of our knowledge of book production in this period, 1,000 copies of the pamphlet is not out of the question. It also is a reasonable figure for the globe, which would have been relatively inexpensive to print. It has been suggested that the planisphere would have been too expensive to print in so great a quantity. However, given Waldseemüller and Ringmann's expressed purpose of the Introductio, to explain the maps, it seems unlikely that the initial printings of 1507 did not include all 3. We know that there were at least 2 versions of the pamphlet printed in April 1507 that were each reprinted in August that same year. We know that at least 1 vendor in Strasbourg sold them as a set based on epistolary evidence. Suggestions have been made that the presses at St. D couldn't have handled the large sheets of the planisphere, but there is no evidence at all to indicate the capacity of the press at Saint-Dié. Since it was the gymnasium's original intention to print their edition of Ptolemy on their own press, it seems reasonable that the same press could have handled the wall map. The fledgling printing industry sparked by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century had exploded by century's end. By 1500, roughly 200 cities and towns across Europe had printing presses, and scholars estimate that somewhere between 8 million and 20 million books had been printed during the 50 years since the first presses were put into operation. By 1600, an estimated 200,000 different books or editions had been printed, many of the popular works, like Marco Polo, in press runs of 800 to 1,000 copies each. Waldseemüller himself wrote in a letter that the books and maps were popular and were being widely disseminated. Certainly, 2 printings in a matter of months suggest that people were buying these geographic sets. We cannot forget that printing presses were commercial enterprises. They didn't print more copies if the sales didn't warrant it. It is possible, therefore, that given this popularity of the 1507 printings, that a total of 1,000 maps were printed, as well as globes and pamphlets. This brief review of the globe gores and what can be known of its printing history is not perhaps as intriguing as what the gores depict: 360 degrees of the Earth for the very first time in print. Its representations of the New World was, according to the Introductio, based primarily on Vespucci's narrative and whatever nautical charts the gymnasium had at its disposal. Viewed in conjunction with the planisphere, it has led to all sorts of speculation about the early discovery of the Pacific Ocean, the early discovery of Florida, secret maps of an already discovered America, and more. It is my intention here to suggest that the globe gores, and therefore also the planisphere, is more a product of a medieval worldview than the key to any number of Renaissance conspiracy theories. A great deal has been written about Christopher Columbus and his world, the books and theories that shaped his worldview, and led him to sail a very small ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Recent work on Amerigo Vespucci has done the same thing for him. Martin Waldseemüller had a similar, though more parochial education than that of Vespucci. And although Columbus was less educated, he was exposed to many of the ideas and theories that dominated humanist circles about the geography of the earth and the formation of the cosmos. The other members of the gymnasium at Saint-Dié, as far as we know, were similarly educated. One aspect of that education that is important to our consideration of the globe gores today is that the idea of the habitable surface of the earth was surrounded entirely by water. This biblical conception suggested that only 1/7 of the earth was covered in water. The rest was land. Roger Bacon, the 13th century scholar and philosopher, strongly supported this view, which implied that there was land of some kind on the other side of the world. Bacon's arguments were repeated almost unchanged by Pierre Daly, the 14th century French theologian and astrologer, whose Imago Mundi contributed to the belief that the size of the earth, particularly the extent of the known lands, that the size of the earth was smaller and the extent of the known lands was larger than they actually were. Numerous maps, from Macrobius in the early Middle Ages to the later Mappa Mundi, depicted the known lands of the earth surrounded by water. And what seems to be the prevailing view in the late 15th century was that this world ocean, as it was called, was filled up with islands. As the Spanish and Portuguese in particular moved out into the Atlantic, islands are what they found. From the Canaries or Fortunate Islands of Ptolemy were added the Azores, the Madeira Archipelago, and the Cape Verde Islands. Medieval Mappa Mundi also depicted so-called imaginary or literary islands, islands that were never found by later explorers of the Atlantic, and gradually were no longer included on maps. These included St. Brendan's Island and the Isle of Maida in the Atlantic, to name just a few. And before I left to come here today, I took a quick look at all the catalogs that Dick Pflederer has produced on the Portland charts in various libraries around the world, and I discovered that almost all of the pre-Columbian editions of the Portland charts included in the catalog include one or more of these imaginary islands. The information in this late medieval world had of Asia from Marco Polo and others also contributed to the conception of a world ocean populated with islands on the other side of the world. The islands south of China, off the coast of India, were known to be the source of the many spices so sought after by Europeans. In the early 15th century, based on surviving sources, 2 other islands began appearing on maps, the large islands of Antigua and Sant'Anasi in the Western Ocean. One of the earliest cartographic and only source for these islands is a nautical chart attributed to an Italian cartographer named Zuane Pizzigano from, Okay, let's go back. There we go. It's dated 1424. This chart is also owned by the James Ford Bell Library, and it depicts these islands as large rectangles colored blue and red, slightly north and south of a line due west of the Iberian Peninsula. And they're quite clear on this particular chart, and you can see this is a very, very bare-bones Portland chart, just a brief sketch of the Iberian Peninsula, a little bit of North Africa. England and Ireland are there. The little dot, the round island up by Ireland is one of those imaginary islands that we talk about, and then there's the big rectangles of Antigua and Sant'Anasi. These same large islands can be found on the 1435 map of Battista Beccari and possibly on his 1426 chart, the 1436 world map of Andreas Bianco, as well as on his regional chart of the same year. And you can see where they're located way out on the edge, looking very similar to those islands as they're depicted on the Pizzigano chart. On Benicassa's map of 1463, on the Pareto chart of 1455, and you can see the island of Artilia there. And by this time, it starts to take on a very stylistic, almost iconographic portrayal, very rectangular. It no longer looks like a real island. It's there because it's supposed to be there, but nobody seems to really know why. The Petrus Roselli map of 1466, again held by the Bell Library, also has these islands in the far west. Toscanelli's lost chart of the 1480s, and this is a very rough, drawing, but I've circled the island of Antillia here. Albinus Canepa's chart of 1489, also at the Bell Library, and also Martin Beheim's globe of 1492 has Antillia and St. Brendan's Island, another fictional, or at least believed to be fictional island. Columbus believed that he could sail west from Spain to this island of Antillia, refuel as it were, before continuing on to Japan, another island, and then on to Cathay or China. His first two voyages found nothing but islands, islands where he expected to find them, and so he believed that he was somewhere off the coast of China or India, and so called them the Indies. When Vespucci's Mundus Novus suggested that one of these islands was continental in size, Waldseemüller had no reason not to accept it. This was the worldview with which he was familiar. In chapter 9 of the Introductio, Waldseemüller and Ringmann write, quote, "The earth is now known to be divided into 4 parts. The first 3 of these are connected and are continents, but the 4th part is an island, because it is understood to be completely surrounded on all of its sides by the sea." End quote. They go on to say, quote, "Just as there is only one earth, there is only one ocean, yet it is made up of many different seas and filled with many islands that go by different names," end quote. Waldseemüller, like Columbus and Vespucci, believed that this 4th part of the world was an island, however large, located in the great Western Ocean that separated Europe from Asia. And this is what he depicted on his globe. And North America, if that is what is truly depicted north of the island he called America, is also depicted as an island. The meridian he placed on its western edge implies, I believe, that it is an island of unknown extent. Johannes Reusch did something quite similar on his 1508 world map. He placed a ribbon of text on the western edge of South America to suggest the extent of the land was unknown. He also put a ribbon on the end of Cuba as well. I've circled Antillia up there. Reusch, contemporaneously with Waldseemüller, populated his map with the legends of a lot of these imaginary islands. So these stories about the islands were quite contemporary, were widely circulated during this period. It is therefore possible, within the context of the prevailing worldview and existing nautical charts, that Waldseemüller was following a much older tradition that placed very large islands far into the Western Ocean, which he then reconciled with the accounts of the discoveries of Columbus and Vespucci and the earlier maps created by some of the voyagers. The island of Antillia on the Pizzigano nautical chart could have morphed on the Waldseemüller globe into the island continent of America, while Sant'Anasi remained the smaller island to the north. This is a very preliminary hypothesis, which requires a lot more study. I do contend here, however, that Waldseemüller's maps do not depict a new ocean, but rather the old ocean of Ptolemy, found to contain the 4th part of the world, as it was believed in the ancients, by the ancients to exist, and found in the form of a great island or islands. The differences in the depiction of these 2 landmasses in the globe and on the inset map of the planisphere remain a question for debate, as do the distinctions between the planisphere and the maps of the 1513 Ptolemy and the Carta Marina. We need a lot more evidence. For now, I believe we should take Waldseemüller at his word. He made conscious decisions to distinguish the globe, the more practical depiction of the Earth, from the planisphere, the more theoretical version. In that, he followed a centuries-old tradition of which Ptolemy himself was a part, a tradition in which cartographers continually sought to balance the known reality with current geographical theories, a tradition that less than 100 years after Waldseemüller published his maps, produced a large body of conflicting views of California, both as the western coast of a large continent and as an island separated from the mainland by the Red Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Chet Van Duzer got interested in maps in the Vatican Museum, looking at a manuscript copy of Ptolemaic, a 16th century, 15th century manuscript copy of Ptolemy. And there was a special map in it, and he became so amazed with that it's really reshaped his career. And we're glad he did. He's published many useful tracts and books about medieval and Renaissance cartography in prestigious journals, including the book Johann Schorner's Globe of 1515, Transcription and Study. But my favorite book, how many of you have bought this book yet? Well, this is my favorite of his works and John Hessler's, and it's for sale. It's an extremely interesting book, and to me, these gentlemen have been puzzling and working with this, and if you compare this with earlier works that they've written, you can just see the maturation of this, bringing this story together. Very interesting work. Now, you should know that Chet really likes oceans. He really likes the ocean, and he's written a lot about islands. In fact, he's written a book about a floating island. Mr. Van Duzer recently completed a Kislock Fellowship at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, doing work, as you know, on the Carta Marina in 1516. And this qualifies him to now wrap us up and enlighten us further on the Carta Marina.
Thank you, Wes, and thanks to all the organizers of this conference. The title of this conference is Redrawing Ptolemy, and I'd like to begin this afternoon with a quick survey of Waldseemüller's cartographic career, and specifically the way he began his career by redrawing Ptolemy, but ended up abandoning the work of the Alexandrine geographer in his second major world map, the Carta Marina. Waldseemüller's famous 1507 world map is a redrawing of a Ptolemaic world map, or more accurately, it is a redrawing of a Ptolemaic world map. For although Waldseemüller certainly used Ptolemy's geography and a world map like this one as a source in making his 1507 map, he also relied heavily on a world map by Enricus Martellus, a German cartographer who worked in Florence. The progression is easy to show. If we compare Martellus's map with the Ptolemaic map, we see similarities in their general shapes. Both have grids of latitude and longitude, and both have decorative wind heads in their borders. So not only the cartographic content, but some of the decorative details are very similar. It is clear, though, that Martellus modified the Ptolemaic model quite a bit. He has modified the projection to accommodate a greater east to west extension. He shows Africa as being circumnavigable. He shows much more of the northern part of the world and shows much more of Asia, including not only the eastern coast of the continent, but also Japan. Thus, he added great swaths of the Earth's surface to what Ptolemy depicts. If we then compare the maps of Martellus and Waldseemüller, we see that Waldseemüller has gone a step further and added the New World to what he found in Martellus. Waldseemüller adopted Ptolemy's framework, more specifically Martellus's framework, and added to it new geographical information. Waldseemüller's next major cartographic work was the maps in the 1513 edition of Ptolemy's Geography. On the one hand, the cartographer's involvement in this project demonstrates his continuing interest in Ptolemy. On the other, the maps involve some redrawing of Ptolemy, and also the offering of an alternative to Ptolemy. This edition quite naturally contains a Ptolemaic world map, which we see here. But even in this case, when he's he's showing Ptolemy's view of the world, he's done some redrawing. Most Ptolemaic world maps have a land bridge joining southern Africa with southern Asia, a mythical landmass that Ptolemy believed enclosed the Indian Ocean to the south. Waldseemüller could not bring himself to represent this landmass that he knew did not exist, and thus he omitted it from the Ptolemaic map. In the same edition of Ptolemy, Waldseemüller presents a modern map of the world and 19 regional maps which are based on nautical charts rather than on Ptolemy. These 20 modern maps create a cartographic parallel universe to Ptolemy's 27 maps, offering the reader a choice between the two cartographic systems and silently indicating a crisis of confidence in Ptolemy's maps. When he came to create his new monumental world map, the Cartography, Waldseemüller made a choice between these two competing cartographic systems, the Ptolemaic tradition and the nautical chart tradition, and based his map on nautical charts. Here, then, he is no longer redrawing Ptolemy, but rather abandoning him, and his abandonment of Ptolemy may be seen in all aspects of the map. To take just one example, the Carta Marina is dense with texts that describe different peoples, regions, and animals, but of all these dozens of texts, there is only one that comes from Ptolemy's geography. After he had abandoned the Ptolemaic model, how did Waldseemüller create this new image of the world? He did not just use nautical charts, but a great variety of books and maps as sources, and a careful analysis of his sources allows us to go inside his workshop in Saint-Dié and essentially watch him at work as he made the Carta Marina. There is no documentary source that gives similar information about how an early 16th century detailed world map was made, and I do not know of another early 16th century map from which information of a similar richness can be deduced. Waldseemüller's world map of 1516 thus provides an engaging and unique opportunity to see a cartographer from this period at work. The Carta Marina, then, is based on nautical chart data and a nautical chart system for representing space. And in fact, we know the specific map that Waldseemüller used as a source for delineating the coastlines of the world, the nautical chart by Niccolò de Caverio of Genoa, made in about 1503, about which you've heard a bit earlier. We know this because of the close similarities of coastal place names between Caverio's chart and Waldseemüller's map, and the striking similarities of layout between Caverio's chart and the Carta Marina. These similarities include the area of the world depicted and the almost identical shapes and positions of the parts of the world. For example, Greenland, the so-called Pseudo-Labrador Island, the east coast of South America, the central coast of Africa and its shape, the two large peninsulas jutting southward in Asia, and the identical location of the nodes of the systems of rhumb lines. Waldseemüller did make one significant departure from the outlines of the Caverio chart, namely with regard to the extent of Eastern Asia that he depicts. If we compare the eastern parts of the two maps, we see that Waldseemüller copied Caverio's coastline very closely, moving up the coastline here. But then he stops abruptly and chooses not to follow Caverio about 14 degrees further to the east. So I've highlighted there the part of Caverio that Waldseemüller chose not to copy. In many ways, the Carta Marina is a practical map, confining itself to areas of the world that were well known or where trade was conducted, rather than trying to depict the entire world. And it seems likely that Waldseemüller chose not to depict the northeastern coast of Asia because he considered it poorly known. Waldseemüller's omission of Japan from the Carta Marina, which he had included on the 1507 map, can be interpreted along the same lines. While Waldseemüller used Caverio's map as a source for coastlines and place names, his map is very different from Caverio's in other respects. This can be seen by comparing the hinterlands on the two maps. Here's Asia on the Caverio map. There are some compass roses and some banners indicating place names, but there is almost no geographical detail whatsoever. And here is exactly the same region on the Carta Marina. The hinterland is crowded with mountain ranges, rivers, images of sovereigns, and texts describing different lands, peoples, and animals. The difference is so dramatic that it's worth showing again. So here's Caverio, and exactly the same part of the Carta Marina. Where did this tremendous wealth of new information come from? In a large text block in the lower left corner of the map, Waldseemüller lists several of his sources. And I will now show how Waldseemüller used those sources to fill his map with information not available on Caverio, so as to create a new and much more detailed image of the world. I will go through his textual sources in chronological order. Waldseemüller says that one of his sources was Marco Polo, the famous 13th century Venetian traveler who left descriptions of the Middle East, Central Asia, China, and the Indian Ocean. On Waldseemüller's 1507 map, almost all of his information about Eastern Asia came from Marco Polo, but on the Carta Marina, the cartographer made much more limited of use of Polo, apparently because he decided to favor more recent sources. Waldseemüller used material from John of Plano Carpini, who, as papal legate, traveled via a northern route to the Great Khan in China in the 13th century. Manuscripts of Carpini's travel narrative are rare, and Waldseemüller almost certainly consulted his travel narrative via the excerpts that Vincent of Beauvais incorporated into his Speculum Historiale, which exists in many manuscript copies and was first printed in Strasbourg in 1473. As we can see here, Plano Carpini was an essential source for Waldseemüller's depiction of northern Asia. Waldseemüller also used the travel narrative of Odoacer Pordenone, an Italian missionary and diplomat who early in the 14th century traveled from Venice across the Middle East to India, visited some islands in the Indian Ocean, and spent 3 years in China. An interesting feature of Waldseemüller's use of Odoacer is that while Odoacer visited many places along the southern coast of Asia, the cartographer used his information only in the interior, no doubt because he had a more recent source for the coastal areas, as we will see shortly. Also appearing in Waldseemüller's list is Pierre d'Ailly, a French cardinal, theologian, and cosmographer who wrote a book titled the Imago Mundi, or Image of the World, in 1410. Waldseemüller used this book as a source for information about the monstrous races in India, which we see here, and also for his description of the Caspian Sea. One of Waldseemüller's most important sources was a book called the Paesi Novamente Ritrovati, or Newly Discovered Countries, a collection of travel narratives that was first published in Italy in 1507. One of the works in this book is a travel narrative of Alvise Cadamosto, a Venetian merchant and navigator who explored the western coast of Africa for Portugal in 1455 and 56. Waldseemüller's legends that derive from Cadamosto are where we would expect them, along the western coast of Africa. In the same book, Waldseemüller found information supplied by Joseph the Indian, or Priest Joseph, a Christian priest from India who shipped with Cabral on his return to Portugal, and in particular, he used Joseph as a source for a long description of the trading center of Calicut, India, which I've highlighted here. The Paesi Novamente Ritrovate was also his authority for the detailed information about the sources and prices of spices in Calicut, which is displayed in the lower right-hand corner of the map. This information about the prices of spices is good evidence of Waldseemüller's desire to make the Carta Marina a practical map. Finally, Waldseemüller made heavy use of the travel narrative of Ludovico de Varthema, an Italian adventurer and keen observer who traveled to Egypt, the Middle East, and India, and islands in the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century. An illustrated edition of Varthema was published in 1515, just 1 year before the Carta Marina, and as we will see below, it is this edition that Waldseemüller used. Varthema provided some of the most recent information about Asia that was available to Waldseemüller, and quite often, when Waldseemüller had the option of using older information from Odoacer Pordenone and the more recent data in Varthema, he used Varthema. We have now seen several maps showing which of the long legends on the Carta Marina came from which books, If we imagine those maps superimposed on each other, we begin to realize what a rich mosaic of information the Carta Marina is, and how much work Waldseemüller devoted to searching his sources for information about the many regions he portrays. Quite often, his information about adjacent regions comes from different books, because his studies had indicated that each of those books was the best source for those specific regions. As we have seen, in the lower corner of the Carta Marina, Waldseemüller names some of the sources he used in compiling the map, but he does not list all of them, and some of those unnamed sources are maps. For example, he used the Cavario map for the cartographic skeleton of the Carta Marina, but he does not mention that map specifically, and he used other maps that he does not list as well. In the South Atlantic, Waldseemüller has a long legend describing the inhabitants of the New World, and the first half of that legend derives from a legend on the world map by Johannes Ruysch, which we've seen before, which appeared in the 1507 edition of Ptolemy's Geography. Thus, we now know that Waldseemüller had a copy of this edition of Ptolemy on his shelf in Saint-Dié. South of the southern tip of Africa, Waldseemüller has an image of King Manuel of Portugal riding a sea monster. This image is a powerful expression of Portugal's control of the sea route around Africa to India, and Waldseemüller's inspiration probably came from Jacopo de Barbari's monumental 6-sheet map view of Venice of circa 1500. In front of the city, right in front of St. Mark's Square, de Barbari has an image of Neptune riding a sea monster and holding aloft a sign that proclaims his protection of Venice. Thus, it seems that Waldseemüller had access to a copy of de Barbari's map, and we know that this map sold for 3 ducats. It's notoriously difficult to determine the modern equivalent of early modern prices, but 3 ducats would have paid for a month's work by an apprentice, so it was not a negligible amount of money. The richness of Waldseemüller's library really was impressive. I would also like to show that Waldseemüller had in his workshop, in addition to the Cavario chart, another nautical chart, specifically a large, richly decorated traditional chart that depicted a larger portion of the Earth's surface than typical charts. A typical nautical chart covers Western Europe and Northern Africa, including some of the Atlantic and some of the Holy Land in the East. And here we see such a chart. Waldseemüller's Carta Marina has 3 elements, which I have circled here in red, that do not appear in any of the sources he cites in the lower left-hand corner of his map, but which do appear in the nautical chart tradition. They lie outside of the area covered by a typical nautical chart, but there were larger nautical charts that depicted more of the Earth's surface, such as this one, the Catalanistense map, which was made in about 1460 and represents an extension of nautical chart data to the edges of the world. And here I've highlighted the normal area covered by a nautical chart. All 3 of the elements I just mentioned on the Carta Marina appear on this chart. First, in the mountains of Armenia, Waldseemüller has an image of Noah's Ark and a brief legend saying that the Ark came to rest on Mount Arach, that is, Mount Ararat. Few of the sources that Waldseemüller cites mention the Ark at all, and those that do fail to name the mountain on which it came to rest. But the Catalanistense map does have an image of Noah's Ark on the mountains of Armenia, which we see here, and similar images appear on other large nautical charts, such as Grazioso Benincasa's chart of 1482. So the same image appears on a few other nautical charts that extend further to the east than the typical nautical charts. Second, in the far northeast of the Carta Marina, there's an image of a man riding a deer, no doubt a reindeer, with a brief legend saying that those in the far north ride deer. Waldseemüller had a similar legend in a similar location on his 1507 map, and the text and its location were inspired by Marco Polo's description of Balor Regio in northern Asia. On the Catalanistense map, it is in Scandinavia that we have an image of a man riding a reindeer, and similar images appear in Scandinavia on other nautical charts, such as Mathias de Villadeste's chart of 1413. What Waldseemüller has done on the Carta Marina, then, is take a nautical chart image of a man riding a reindeer from its location in Scandinavia and relocate it in the distant northeast in accordance with Marco Polo's description. Third, the name that Waldseemüller uses for the Caspian Sea on the Carta Marina comes from a nautical chart. Here, he calls it Mare Abacuk sive Mare de Sala, and this is quite different than the name he used for the sea on his 1507 map, Mare Hyrcanum sive Caspium, and is also quite different from the name used in any of the sources he cites in the lower left corner of the Carta Marina. However, it is very similar to the name used on the Catalanistense map, Mar de Sala e de Baku, and also to the names used on some other large nautical charts. The name on the Catalanistense map is actually the most similar I have found to that on the Carta Marina, but in any case, the name is one proper to the nautical chart tradition and demonstrates that Waldseemüller was using a large nautical chart that showed the eastern parts of the world. These three elements allow us to be quite confident that Waldseemüller had a large, abundantly decorated nautical chart in his workshop, something like the Catalanistense map, or like a similar map from about 1375, of which just a fragment survives in the Topkapi. You can see it from the edge there, it has the same circular form as the Catalanistense. Or like the Catalan Atlas of 1375, which extends from the Atlantic all the way to the eastern coast of Asia. The Catalan Atlas may have been commissioned by the House of Aragon as a gift for Charles V of France, so Waldseemüller's possession of a map of this caliber again raises the question of how his map purchases were financed. We do not know the original price of these large charts, but we can perhaps get some idea of the cost from the fact that a circular wall map donated by Antonio Leonardi to Pope Pius II in 1462 was valued at 25 ducats, a substantial sum. It is likely that Waldseemüller had financial support from Duke René II of Lorraine, but this question deserves more detailed exploration. Next, we'll look at the sources of some of the images that Waldseemüller used to decorate the Carta Marina. This map has many more illustrations than the 1507 map, and it is easy to imagine that the cartographer was proud of the iconographic richness of this map. The image of Mecca on the map comes from the illustrated 1515 edition of Varthema's Travels. Curiously, Waldseemüller borrowed the image of Medina from the book and used it for Mecca, perhaps out of a desire to use a distinctive image for the better-known city. The image of a king in India is borrowed from an illustration in the 1509 edition of Springer's Travels. The clothing of the two kings is the same, except that Waldseemüller has added a crown on top of the turban, and the pikes that the kings hold are very similar, except that Waldseemüller did not draw the full length of the handle. Also in India, Waldseemüller has an image of Suti, the Hindu practice whereby a widow burned herself to death on the funeral pyre of her husband. In this case, the widow has leapt into the hole where the funeral pyre has been made, and a man stands over her and is ready to strike her with something, no doubt so that she will die sooner. On the right, a horned demon stands looking on. This scene was clearly inspired by the image in the 1515 edition of Varthema's Travels, and Varthema mentions the presence of demons in his narrative. Waldseemüller has an image of the rhinoceros in Africa, and it has been suggested that he copied the depiction from Dürer's famous print of the rhino from 1515. But this is not the case. Durer gives his rhino a small extra horn on its shoulder, while Waldseemüller's has some hair in the same position. But there is another print of the rhino, made in the same year, 1515, by Hans Bergmair, that has hairs on its shoulder, just like Waldseemüller's. The date of this print, just 1 year before the Carta Marina came off the press, demonstrates that Waldseemüller continued to keep his eyes out for new sources until close to the date of its publication. Moreover, the fact that Bergmair's print of the rhino was used rather than Dürer's makes it unlikely that Durer was involved in cutting the blocks for the Carta Marina, as some have suggested. Oops, there's a straight comparison. I do not mean to imply that all of the mysteries of the Carta Marina have been solved. Indeed, in a document so rich and complex, it is inevitable that some questions about sources will be difficult of solution. For example, the description of the Moluccas says that cloves grow on the island and are carried thence to Malacca, and I have not found this information in a source earlier than the map. Waldseemüller's depiction of Russia is remarkably advanced for its time, and the source of some of his descriptions has eluded me. And in addition, the coat of arms, which from its position could belong to Novgorod or to the Emperor of Russia, I'll zoom in a bit there, does not match the coat of arms of either entity in the early modern period. At this point, I was going to say that I've not been able to find the source for Waldseemüller's depiction of the Great Khan, which you see here, which is very impressive and imposing. The earlier images I had examined, for example, the Khan in this 15th century manuscript of Marco Polo, and this image in Luis de Langle, Tractatus de Figura su Imagine Mundi, lack the imperiousness of Waldseemüller's image. However, 2 days ago, I was in Rare Books and had a conversation with Ilaria Andreolovi, and she suggested that the source is Dürer's portrait of Charlemagne, made in about 1512. So while the map continues to offer challenges to those who study it, the challenges do have solutions. The Carta Marina is the product of Waldseemüller's cartographic maturity. He had come to understand that despite Ptolemy's elegance and the respect in which humanists held the authors of classical antiquity, the geographic information on nautical charts was more accurate, and he also understood that a map with modern place names was more useful and practical than one with classical names. In addition, he had come to realize that the books of recent explorers offered sources of information, both textual and visual, that would permit the creation of an entirely new image of the world, a multimedia resource with new data about trade, politics, ethnography, and animal life. Creating that image entailed the assembly of an extensive library and careful research to select and then weave together the phrases and images that would most effectively and accurately reveal to viewers of the map what he thought should be known about the world. The Carta Marina is Waldseemüller's most original creation and shows its author, about whom we otherwise know so little, to have been a man of great thoroughness, energy, and vision. He began his cartographic career by redrawing Ptolemy, but ended it by creating something entirely new, a mosaic image of the world with each stone of his own careful choosing. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ragnow, Dr. Davis. What a wonderful combination of programs that were so thoughtfully conceived by the library staff. And the four speakers, I know, really deserve your round of applause again. And their professionalism really shows itself in the way they each manage their time so skillfully. And that means we have some time for questions. And so I'd like to ask that when you have a question, you stand up, let's get the mic to you, and say your name before you begin. We have one right in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Tom Sander. I have a question for Chet Van Duzer. Chet, your work on the Carta Marina is fantastic, and the whole work of the people in Santiago is very fantastic. But I'm just wondering how they've gotten all this information without a Barnes & Noble down the street. Here we find materials from all over the world, from Marco Polo, from all these other sources that you've cited. Here we have Santiago deep in the Vosges Mountains, a tiny little village, not even on the Rhine. Certainly I could understand some of this if it came from Naples or Genoa or someplace like that. Where did he get all these books? Where did he get all these materials? What kind of information flow went in there with such deliberate nature?
Well, as I suggested, that question still needs more research. I mean, Ringmann, Mathias Ringmann, Waldseemüller's associate, made trips to Italy, and it's quite possible that he was purchasing maps and books while he was there. But we don't have the full answer. I mean, and again, there was certainly support from Duke René II, but more information about how this fantastic library was assembled would be very welcome. And it's a question that continues to interest me.
No more questions for these experts? Well, it must be, oh, we have one more. I was able to coax one more out.
My name's Georgina Ranard, and I've got a question for Surekha. I wanted to ask why you think, what was the appeal of depicting cannibals when there were actually other descriptions of indigenous people in, for example, Columbus's accounts, as you pointed out. But I wanted to ask why you think they chose cannibalism over others. So.
Thank you for your question. That's a very interesting question that becomes even more interesting when you put that choice in the broader context of the choices that map makers have made across the Americas. I mean, if you look at the choice of cannibalism for Brazil by itself, you might imagine that, well, these map makers were trying to sell maps. These are sensational images. This is like a tabloid newspaper. Surely they chose something gory simply because it would sell better. But the thing is, scholars, readers, people who bought maps had already been very suspicious and had already been complaining about the range of things that travelers could claim they had seen, because none of us could actually test these things. So showing something extraordinary and gory wasn't necessarily going to help you to sell maps, because your viewers might decide not to believe you. And the whole the thing about map makers who were based in Europe is their entire kind of authority was based on seeming to convey truths. The rhetoric of these maps were that they were very accurate and using very new information. So they needed, on the one hand, to show how wondrous the distant East could be, because that was what you were expecting to find, but not so wondrous that it looked like it was made up. And I think the reason that cannibalism in particular was chosen was it helped viewers to really think about these as the potentially very different kind of people. And one of the things that maps allowed you to do is to compare difference. So this is a very notionally different kind of practice. Secondly, South America in the 1516 Carta Magna is a long way south. You know, I keep talking about the northern tip of South America, but actually it's more like the latitude somewhere like Java, which had cannibals. I think it's a little bit complicated, but I think what this choice shows is an attempt to show human diversity across different geographical areas. And while trading is an attractive trope, map makers mapping the whole of the Americas in the long 16th century, and indeed elsewhere, weren't interested in showing you trading opportunities. What all the iconography shows from, say, Virginia down to Patagonia is a concern with delineating the range of human experience. And I think showing trade wasn't going to show that as much as cannibalism. But again, once you set cannibalism in Brazil, other places ended up having other things chosen out of the travel accounts, but things that allowed you to tell a Patagonian giant from a Brazilian cannibal, from the highly sophisticated urban societies of Peru and Mexico, where it is the cities that are used to emblematize the people and not the human sacrifice. So I think this is a program of showing the variety of humanity. I hope that answers your question.
I have one more in the middle.
Hate to monopolize, but Tom Sander again, this time for Dick Pflederer. Dick, you've spent many, many years of your life looking at hundreds of Portolan charts in so many different places. Tell me, as of the time period you discussed today, the Waldseemüller time period, of all the Portolan charts that you examined, of the French, the Italian, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and etc., which were the better map makers, the better Portolan chart makers, the better sailors? Which did a better job in your estimation as you evaluate all these Portolan charts?
Good question. I think it's appropriate in that year of, say, 1516, to really divide the genre in two parts. The one part is the traditional Med Sea, which was clearly dominated by the Italians. Maybe 2/3 of all the surviving charts we have of that period are Italian production. Separate that from the oceanic, and in that case, the Portuguese clearly dominated, and the Italian charts that we have, or the French charts that we have, the Norman charts we have, are in most cases derivative of the Portuguese. In terms of the beauty of the charts, some of the most spectacular, let's say, presentation pieces, which were not for navigation, were by Fernand Vaz de Rada, who's a Portuguese, by Jean Roets, who was working in London, but he was Norman. And so those charts were possibly more beautiful, but again, oceanic, give that to the Portuguese, Med Sea, and the traditional waters, give that to the Italians.
Any more questions? We have one up front.
I'd like to follow up on that question in that, in looking at these maps, the depictions of the Islamic world, particularly the Persian Gulf, are very inaccurate, and the depiction of the Arabian Peninsula. So it seemed there was no European trading with the Islamic world at that time, and they jump right across the Indian Ocean to India.
First off, this tradition of Portolan charts was a European invention. And as I said at the beginning, for the first 300 years, it was basically limited to the Med Sea and adjacent waters. Obviously, the Europeans were doing a lot of trading with the Indian Ocean, but that part of the trade was conducted and managed by Arab traders up the Red Sea, and the Europeans took over the goods in Alexandria, places like that. When the Portuguese went around Asia, went into the west coast of India, in fact, they did a significant amount of work in the northern part of the Indian Ocean and even into the Red Sea, and there were battles and there were trading outposts in that area as well. And so, but you'd have to be looking a little bit later than this period. If you looked at Portolan charts, particularly Portuguese charts from, let's just say, the middle of the 16th century, I think you'd see a little bit better representation of that area you're speaking of.
This is for Marguerite. One of the great fears of us here at the Library of Congress is that some librarian in some small castle someplace is going to open up a book and there will be another copy of the 1507 map. So I want to get your impressions of what it's like to have the first one, but then the continual rediscovery of new editions of it. How does it make...
Don't be scared.
Okay. It'll be okay?
It's actually very exciting. Every time another copy of the Gores is found, we learn something new. We learn differences between the different editions. For example, the two in Germany don't have the watermarks that the other two have. So what does that mean? They often raise more questions than we can certainly answer, but anytime we find another copy, I think that's a boon to scholarship, a boon for those of us interested in understanding the dissemination of printing culture, knowing where they got to. When we talk about the quantities of the books and the maps printed, the more copies we find, that helps us get a better understanding, perhaps, of distribution, of print runs, etc. So I'm looking forward to when they find another wall map.
One other point, John. Their $40,000 investment is documented to be worth over $1 million today, so I don't think they're complaining up in Minnesota.
This question is about the possible preservation challenges you found with the materials you're generously sharing with us today. And this question's for Marguerite. And thank you.
Sure. They're not any different than anyone else's. The paper used for the gores is in really excellent condition, but we decided a few years ago, because people are interested in it, to have it encapsulated. So it is preserved between sheets of mylar that then are taped together, and then there's a removable frame so that you can hold it up and look at the watermark and examine it in every respect, but no one touches it any longer. We do keep it in climate-controlled vault. It rarely goes on exhibit at our institution, but we pull it out for anyone who wants to come and see it in the reading room. So I think we're lucky in that it's in such good shape, and because it's small, encapsulating it made a whole lot of sense, as long as we could preserve all of those aspects of study, so we can still look at the chain lines, we can still look at the watermark, we can still study the paper. So.
We have a question in the corner.
Gary Fitzpatrick. For Mr. Van Duzer or anyone else who would wish to comment, do you see any evidence in or any reflection between the 1507 map and the Carta Marina of movement of location of specific features that might be a result of expanding knowledge of the size of the Earth as they developed a better understanding that it was bigger than what Ptolemy thought?
Your specific question is about their understanding of the size of the Earth?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you see this reflecting an increased knowledge of what the true size of the Earth was?
That's a good question. I don't. The outlines of the world on the Carta Marina were, taken from Caverio, so it doesn't seem like he put much calculation into that aspect of the map. It's an interesting question, though.
Well, I would like to ask that all of our speakers remain in this area, because you may have questions to talk to them individually. And if our chief could come forward of the map division, who's conceived of this and organized this, to give us a few final words to close us out. And I just have to recognize what a wonderful audience this is for our speakers to get to participate with.
We'll be having the wine and cheese party after this, so that the audience will be able to talk with the speakers. So I think you can. Thank you for this wonderful session, and we completed on time, so we'll be able to move up to the wine and cheese party shortly. But I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge those who made this conference possible. As with such undertakings, many persons have contributed. The great program that we had today was conceived and organized by John Hessler. Despite his comment when I started 2 years ago, and someone else mentioned this, that he was moving beyond Waldseemüller, we were able to persuade him to do one more conference. And it was based on all of the new research, in part which he did and which he led. But I think we owe a round of applause for John for conceiving the idea and organizing it. Thanks, John. And John was supported by people in the Geography Map Division, other members of the staff, notably Jennifer Smosky, who organized and worked with the speakers to bring them here, and Cheryl Lane and Ed Redmond on our staff. I also want to thank Liz Morrison, Special Events Coordinator, and Donna Urschel, Public Affairs Specialist in Library Affairs Office. Of course, there would have been no conference without the real stars of this event, the 5 Waldseemüller maps that we've been discussing. And these are on display upstairs. I want to remind everyone again. They're on the second floor in our exploratory the Americas Gallery. And John and Chet will be giving tours of that tomorrow, beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning and on the half hour through 12 o'clock. We're greatly indebted, of course, to Jerry Lensfest, who chairman of the James Madison Council, David Koch, the Discovery Channel, and the U.S. Congress for the acquisition of the 1507 map. Jay and Jean Kislak, who reunited the Waldseemüller corpus with their deposit of the 1516 Carta Marina and Waldseemüller portfolio, and former German-Dutch specialist Marguerite Crutzen, who played a major role in facilitating the acquisitions of both of these maps. George Tobolowsky and Virginia Gray also contributed matching funds and provided additional support for the preservation, exhibition, and study of these maps. I also want to thank Susan Danforth and David Parsons and the John Carter Brown Library for making possible the loan of their unique JCB Stevens version of the Waldseemüller map, and Dr. Ragnow and James Ford Bell Library for their loan of the globe gores. Tamara Johnson, Kimberly Curry, Karen Worth, Chris O'Connor, and William Jacobs of the Interpretive Programs Office did a marvelous job in mounting the exhibit, the maps that we borrowed, and they produced this under a very incredibly short deadline of providing their transfer here and so forth, so we're very thankful to them. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the speakers. We've done that already, and for sharing their knowledge and insight on Waldseemüller and his maps. The moderators for doing such a good job in generating discussion, and for all of you who participated and for your participation and thoughtful questions. These presentations will be available on the library's online website through a webcast in the near future. We also plan to publish the proceedings of this conference and the first Waldseemüller conference. We hope to do that this year, and we're hoping to have Chet come in to do that for us. Tomorrow, the Geography and Map Division will hold an open house in its reading room in the Madison Building from 9 a.m. to noon. We're going to put out a large number of our treasures. They'll be on display. We'll provide behind-the-scenes tours of our scanning and storage facilities. And some of the treasures will be from our Hauslab Liechtenstein collection, minus the globe. I wasn't aware that the globe gores came from the Hauslab Liechtenstein collection. But we acquired that in the 1970s, about 3,000 maps. But we didn't acquire it. It didn't include one of the great maps, of course.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.